In Vietnam's largest U.S. base, something unspoken kept the most elite soldiers apart. The Special Air Service Regiment, SASR, jungle-trained, invisible, and feared for their results, walked among American Green Berets, but not beside them. Legends tell of a single Australian entering a crowded room and silence falling hard, as if some deeper truth was being avoided. What made these allies so effective, and why did mere proximity spark unease? The reasons run deeper than rivalry into tactics, ethics, and the lines drawn in war. This is the story behind the distance. Silence in a room can mean many things. In war, it often means more than fear of a person. It signals an unease with what that person represents. In Vietnam, the distance between Allied special forces was not just a matter of rivalry or reputation. It was a sign of something deeper, the discomfort that comes from knowing too much about how the war was actually being fought. For some, this was not the fear of violence or of the unknown enemy, but the knowledge that certain methods, however effective, came at a cost that could not be measured in medals or statistics. Within the walls of Long Binh, or the outposts at Nui Dat, the presence of an Australian Special Air Service trooper was a living reminder that there were ways to win that did not fit the official script. Rumors filled the gaps where reports left off. Stories traveled faster than facts, and the line between legend and reality blurred. What unsettled people most was not the man, but the idea that his very existence pointed to choices and consequences that many preferred not to examine too closely. This is the kind of fear that lingers long after the fighting stops. It is not about physical danger, but about the weight of understanding what happens when rules are bent or broken for the sake of results. In military culture, some knowledge is quietly avoided, not because it is secret, but because it is heavy. The silence in that mess hall was not empty. It was loaded with the awareness that, in war, some lines once crossed change not only the outcome, but those who cross them. In the thick forests of Phuoc Tuy Province, a small Australian unit operated with a singular purpose. The Special Air Service Regiment, SASR, arrived in Vietnam in 1966 and remained until 1971, rotating squadrons through their forward base at Nui Dat. Their numbers were never large, just 3 Sabre squadrons, each taking turns on year-long tours. But their impact was outsized. Tasked as the reconnaissance and intelligence arm of the 1st Australian Task Force, the SASR's mission was to move ahead of the main force, gathering information, watching enemy patterns, and striking only when it mattered. These patrols rarely exceeded 5 men. These small teams slipped into the jungle for days at a time, often unseen and unheard, charting enemy movement and mapping trails. They served as the eyes and ears for the 1st Australian Task Force, providing the kind of granular detail that shaped every major Australian operation in the province and beyond. The unit's roots stretched back to the British SAS tradition, with long-range reconnaissance, deep penetration, and fieldcraft honed for survival in hostile terrain. Unlike American units, which often relied on helicopters and rapid, aggressive maneuvers, the Australians stripped their tactics down to the essentials. Movement was deliberate and silent. Firepower was a tool of last resort. The SASR's effectiveness depended on patience, discipline, and the ability to disappear into the landscape. Their area of operations extended beyond Phuoc Tuy when needed, but Nui Dat remained their hub, a patch of red earth and tents in the middle of the jungle, from which hundreds of patrols set out over 5 years. This was not a war of big battles for the SASR. It was a war of information, of watching and waiting, of shaping the battlefield before the first shot was ever fired. The SASR's presence at Nui Dat was quiet, but the results of their work echoed far beyond the wire. Every tight-knit community has its own language. In the world of special operations, few nicknames have traveled farther or stuck harder than Snake Eater. The phrase did not start in Vietnam. It came from old survival courses where trainees were expected to eat what the jungle offered, venomous or not. Instructors used it as a badge of toughness, a shorthand for anyone who could make do with nothing but a knife, a canteen, and a stubborn will to keep moving. Over time, Snake Eater became a catch-all for the men who thrived where others stalled. In Vietnam, the term drifted between units, applied to American Green Berets, British SAS, and most enduringly to the Australians at NUIDAT. It was rarely said to someone's face. More often, it floated through the rumor mill attached to stories about patrols that vanished into the jungle and reappeared days later, leaner, quieter, and somehow changed. For the Australians, the label was less about bravado than about a certain kind of reputation. It meant you were the sort who could wait out a monsoon, move without leaving a trace, and if needed, survive on whatever the bush provided. The nickname carried a warning. These men operated by different rules, and it was best not to assume you understood where those rules ended. In the mess halls and outposts, Snake Eater became a way to explain the unexplainable. Why did some soldiers seem untouchable? Why did their presence make others uneasy? The truth was simpler than the stories. It was about the aura that comes from living close to the edge, an aura that does not need proof, only the quiet respect of those who have seen it up close. The nickname stuck, not because of any single act, but because it captured the mystery and the distance that always seemed to surround the Australians at NUIDAT. Numbers carry weight in war, but they rarely tell the whole story. The Special Air Service Regiment record in Vietnam is often reduced to a handful of headline figures. Over 5 years, Special Air Service Regiment patrols left Nui Dat more than 1,000 times. Official summaries put the number at around 1,200 for Vietnam alone, with some sources quoting over 1,400 when including earlier campaigns in Borneo. These teams reported thousands of enemy movements, tracked supply columns, and mapped trails that regular forces would never see. In 298 documented contacts, the Australians accounted for more than 490 confirmed enemy killed and over 100 more listed as possible. The scale of their intelligence reporting gave the 1st Australian Task Force a map of the battlefield that was both broad and deep. These statistics, repeated in books and interviews, are sometimes misapplied. The figure of 5,600 enemy movements reported, for example, is an aggregate from both Borneo and Vietnam, not Vietnam alone. Even the number of patrols is sometimes inflated in retellings, as the legend of the unit grows. But the core facts remain. The Special Air Service Regiment output, measured against its size, was extraordinary. Fewer than 600 men served with the regiment in Vietnam, and their operational footprint covered the most dangerous months of the war. The most persistent myth is the claim of 0 Special Air Service Regiment casualties during Vietnam patrol operations. It is a story that circulates in documentaries and online forums, held up as proof of unmatched skill. The reality is more complex. Australia lost around 500 personnel in Vietnam, the majority from the Army. The Special Air Service Regiment's own losses were remarkably low for the intensity and duration of their work, but not 0. Official records note at least 1 killed in action, others lost to wounds, accidents, or illness, and more than 24 wounded. In 1969, a missing trooper was recovered decades later, a reminder that even the most disciplined unit could not escape the risks of jungle warfare. These figures matter, not because they prove invincibility, but because they ground the story in what can be verified. The Special Air Service Regiment reputation was built on results, not on myths. Their effectiveness can be measured in the intelligence they provided and the enemy movements they disrupted, not just in body counts or tall tales. In the end, the numbers speak to a method that was quiet, deliberate, and above all, real. American and Australian Special Forces entered Vietnam with the same uniforms, the same weapons, and the same enemy. But they brought 2 very different ways of waging war. In the American camp, doctrine was built around speed and power. The Green Berets, like other U.S. units, relied on helicopters to leapfrog through the jungle, searching for contact. Operations were mapped out in terms of territory seized, enemy killed, and missions completed. Fire support, artillery, gunships, and quick reaction teams stood ready to answer any call. Each move was tracked, logged, and measured. Results had to be visible, and above all, countable. For the Australians at Nui Dat, the jungle was not a place to conquer, but a landscape to vanish into. Their Special Air Service Regiment patrols moved in 5-man teams, carrying only what they could shoulder. They left behind the comfort of radio chatter and the safety of heavy backup. The mission was to see without being seen, to listen without being heard, to shape the battlefield by presence alone. Where Americans marked progress in body counts and grid squares, the Australians measured success in what did not happen. Enemy convoys that never left, ambushes that never formed, trails that grew silent. This contrast ran deeper than tactics. American command, under Military Assistance Command Vietnam, demanded proof. Helicopter insertions, rapid contact, and big operations could be briefed to generals and reported to Congress. The pressure was constant. Show results, justify the cost, make the war legible to those far from the mud and heat. Green Berets, trained to work with local forces and strike deep, still operated within this system. Their patrols were rarely left to drift for days without updates. Each engagement was a line item in a ledger. Australian Special Air Service Regiment teams, by design, slipped outside this logic. Their doctrine, inherited from the British Special Air Service, was built on patience and invisibility. A patrol might spend days in one patch of jungle, watching, learning, waiting for a pattern to reveal itself. Contact with the enemy was not the goal, it was often a sign that something had gone wrong. The Australians trusted that a handful of men, properly trained and almost invisible, could have an outsized effect. But this kind of impact did not fit easily into American reports or satisfy the appetite for clear, quantifiable wins. Green Berets who spent time alongside the Australians sometimes came away unsettled. The methods worked, but they were hard to explain to a headquarters looking for numbers. The jungle, for the Special Air Service Regiment, was not just a battlefield, it was a tool, a shield, and sometimes a judge. In this environment, the American way of war and the Australian approach often seemed not just different, but mutually incomprehensible. The numbers on paper did not capture the gap. The real divide was in how each side understood what it meant to fight and what it meant to win. 5 men. That was the anatomy of an Australian SASR patrol in Vietnam. No more, no less. Each moved as if the jungle itself had swallowed him. The routine began before first light. Boots checked, webbing stripped of anything that might rattle, every buckle taped, every metal edge wrapped. Even the rifles were carried close, hands gloved to muffle the smallest click. Patrols could last days. Communication dropped to the bare minimum, just hand signals and the occasional whisper if the wind was right. Radios stayed mostly silent, reserved for emergencies. The team learned to read the forest's rhythm, pausing for hours to let the jungle forget their presence. Stillness became a weapon. A snapped twig or a cough could betray the entire patrol, so each man learned to control his breathing, even his heartbeat. Food was taken cold, water rationed, and movement planned for the moments when birds called or rain hammered the leaves. One SASR trooper later recalled, "You become part of the bush. If you are not, you do not last." Tracks were swept away, boot prints disguised, and every rest spot left as if no one had ever been there. In this environment, patience was the sharpest blade. The goal was simple: to be everywhere and nowhere, to see without being seen. This discipline, an art more than a tactic, set the Australians apart, and it shaped every outcome that followed. In Phuoc Tuy, the enemy learned quickly that movement could be fatal. After an SASR patrol passed through an area, Viet Cong units began to avoid trails that once seemed safe. Reports filtered in of enemy columns halting for hours, sometimes days, unwilling to risk the silent eyes they could not see. Australian teams rarely left traces, but their presence was felt in every decision the enemy made. The jungle itself became a warning, and the cost of a careless footstep grew higher with every patrol that vanished into the green and returned with new intelligence. Stories began to circulate, some whispered by Allied troops, others carried by the enemy. There were tales of bodies found arranged in strange ways, of cards left behind, of signs that said, in effect, "You are being watched." Most of these details remain unverified, more legend than record. What mattered was not the truth of any single story, but the effect they produced. The fear of being hunted by something you could not see or hear changed the way the enemy moved, planned, and even slept. This was psychological warfare at its most subtle. The Australians did not need to announce their presence. The rumors did the work for them, spreading uncertainty and hesitation through the ranks of those who opposed them. In this environment, silence became as powerful as any weapon. The jungle grew quieter, not because the enemy had been defeated, but because they had learned to fear what might be waiting in the stillness. Rules in Vietnam were never just lines on a page. For the American command, every operation had to be measured, reported, and explained, first to headquarters, then to Congress, and sometimes to the world. Anything that could not be counted or traced made leaders nervous. The Australian Special Air Service Regiment worked in the shadows, often beyond the reach of immediate oversight. Their effectiveness depended on ambiguity, on being untraceable, on leaving outcomes that could not always be filed away in a report. This difference was more than doctrine. It was about what institutions could tolerate and what they could not risk being seen to approve. Commanders on both sides understood that some results came at a price. For the Americans, the cost was political. Tactics that blurred the line between reconnaissance and psychological warfare, tactics that left the enemy guessing or that left behind a chill in the air, risked media scrutiny and questions from above. For the Australians, the price was personal. Some Special Air Service Regiment veterans later spoke of the toll exacted by their methods, a constant state of alertness that followed them home, a kind of vigilance that did not fade with the war. Not all described it the same way, but the pattern appeared: difficulty sleeping, trouble relaxing, the sense that the jungle's silence had followed them back into civilian life. There was a logic to keeping distance, and it was not just about legality. As one Green Beret put it, plausible deniability is not just legal, it is psychological. Institutions need to believe that some things are unknowable, even when the evidence sits across the table. Excellence in this kind of war demanded a mindset that few could carry for long, and even fewer could leave behind. Some forms of effectiveness leave a mark that rules and policies are designed to avoid, not because they fail, but because they work too well, and at a cost that cannot be measured in after-action reports. Today, Special Operations Forces still wrestle with the line between effectiveness and accountability, a debate shaped as much by myth as by doctrine. In every war, some methods are too effective to embrace openly and too costly to ignore. The silence between allies lingers, reminding us that the hardest truths in conflict rarely fit within official records. What would you choose to know, and what would you rather not?